everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Cam. I'm the Social Impact Manager at GoOne. I'm joined by two pretty incredible people today. But before I ask them to introduce themselves and go through that, I will acknowledge the country in which we gather, the elders past, present and emerging, and for me that's Yagara and Turrbal people, the traditions of storytelling that allow us to do gatherings like this and kind of exchange ideas and to come forward and the amount that we've learned. I think it's a very important time to be discussing topics like this. And I also feel very privileged to be able to create a platform in which people can discuss ideas like this. And with kind of the first thing for that, I think, is to know who we're talking to. So Maureen, would you be able to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Maureen Frank. I like to call myself the Chief Disruption Officer at embed, but I run a business called embed. I've been in the diversity and inclusion space for the last 15 years or so, worked with companies all over the globe, and I guess my objective is to challenge the status quo on diversity and inclusion, because I'm really determined to help some organisations get some real results.
And I know that we're very excited to be working with embed. They've got a few courses on GoOne, but even just in a broader sense, I think we've already learned a lot from just chatting to Maureen about what we can do to improve the way we work. And I would also like to introduce Elise. Elise, would you be able to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Elise Stephenson. I'm co-founder and director of Social Good Outpost, which is a communications and strategy agency that works with a lot of women-led, LGBTI and other organisations. And in fact, we partnered with GoOne and Wavelength Medical Education to provide LGBTI medical training for doctors and students a while ago. So it's really great to be still working together. I'm also a researcher in women's leadership, amongst other things, at Griffith University. I'm a member of the Inclusive Brisbane Board at Brisbane City Council here in Queensland, basically looking at, well, how can we create the most diverse and inclusive and prosperous cities? And I'm also on the Queensland State Government LGBTI Roundtable and a few national bodies to do the same. So very thrilled to be here. I'm very passionate about bringing the voices who aren't in the room into the room too, and just acknowledging who's not here currently, but that we're trying to have a really kind of comprehensive discussion. So feel free to ask questions as we go.
Yes, that is a key point, actually. Please ask questions. You can put them in the question function and upvote. You can just drop them in the chat. I'll be going through as we go and trying to make sure that I'm putting them to our two kind of panelists today. In fact, I will get rid of the background so that you can actually see the people who are talking. And I think the key thing that I'll just add a little intro and then try and step out of the way as much as possible, because I'm not the expert here. I really wanted to hear from you two and facilitate a discussion. So I think the core for me, when we were looking at what webinar we should do next and what we should chat about, was that when we've done a few on mental health, it kept being highlighted that we had, the bushfires, we then had COVID hit, and in between all of that, there was we had, the riots in Hong Kong, and we had a whole bunch of kind of strains on society and the way that we were working and the way that things are structured in the last 6 months in particular, which I think have echoed a lot of kind of undercurrents that have been around and that we're seeing. And people are talking about a phase of rebuilding right now. And I said, I think the challenge I put out on LinkedIn was, if we are rebuilding, then how can we be rebuilding for a better place? So I'd love to start with what does, I guess, if we look at the status quo right now with diversity and inclusion look like? And I'll throw that one to you, Maureen, because you've seen it from across for a fair while.
Look, I guess to me, my frustration pre-COVID with diversity and inclusion was that it was still very much a ticker box exercise, right? So that organisations were just doing things for the sake of it. They weren't really focused on habit shift, behavioural change, real change. And then COVID hit, and everyone, in my battle to train people as inclusive leaders, it kind of moved people from primary school to their master's degree in having to manage people who are working from home. And then we've had another interesting development, with, the racial situation in the United States. And suddenly I think, diversity and inclusion has elevated to really being a top priority. What I'm seeing is that some organisations are knee-jerking and announcing the sudden things that they're doing in terms of diversity and inclusion and racial issues and what have you. And I think what the world is screaming for and what employees are screaming for is authenticity. They're actually sick of the rhetoric. They're sick of people talking the talk. They want to see real stuff. So I think the way that we've done things historically just isn't going to cut it anymore.
I think that's an interesting one that I'd love to kind of get your take on, Elise, as well. So there were a couple of things that you really wanted to make sure were brought to the fore when we were talking about diversity and inclusion. When I approached and said, "Oh, can we talk about the female leaders part?" And I think there were a few things you raised with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the really big things to firstly acknowledge is, you know, historically when we've looked at diversity and inclusion, or even when we've looked at, you know, research on gender equality, for instance, there has been a tendency for that to be very white and, you know, upper middle class, and looking at, you know, just one intersection of a person's identity, so their gender. But in the 1980s, brilliant Black feminist researcher in the United States, Kimberly Crenshaw, she did this really seminal research, I suppose, on what is called intersectionality. If you haven't heard of it before, it's basically the idea that as humans, we have different intersections of our identities. So, you know, it might be, you know, that I identify as a woman, I identify as LGBTI, I'm of a, you know, European background, and essentially acknowledging that, you know, all of these different backgrounds or intersections of our identity can pile onto each other to have a cumulative effect. So if we're looking at disadvantage or opportunities in the workplace, as in life, we have to recognize that, you know, not all women are equal, not all men are equal, you know, within disability, within sexuality, religion, ethnicity. Basically, we have just such a composite of identities. So when we actually do look at trying to basically have the most diverse and wonderful and prosperous organizations, we really have to make sure, okay, well, are we doing this in a way that is intersectional across a whole range of kind of criteria? And I suppose, you know, when you're talking about what's the situation pre-COVID, I'd just like to point out that only in the last year was some research done by the United Nations that found that there is, across the world, globally, 90% of people have a gender bias against women. I mean, this is just absolutely insane. And in one of the kind of fields of research that I focus on, which is international affairs, from 1992 till now, women have only been involved in 2% of chief negotiations around peace, war and peace, what happens after conflict. And if we're looking at Australia, while Anglo-Celtic or European background people represent 76% of the population, they're in 94.6% of leadership roles. And when you break it down, I mean, this Black Lives Matter movement, Indigenous Lives Matter movement is just so important to how we're then looking at our organizations and structuring diversity and inclusion, or maybe even, you know, stripping down those systems and structures right to the base and starting again. Particularly because here in Australia, again, when we're looking at senior leadership, Indigenous people represent 3% of the population and only 0.4% of senior executive management. For Asian, Middle Eastern, North African and other non-European background individuals in Australia, they represent 21% of the population, but only 5% of leaders. So really, when you're looking at diversity and inclusion, you know, just figure out what you know about some of the traditional things. We really want to look at what is actually a truly diverse, what is actually a truly supportive and prosperous community or organization that we're building.
Wow, there's some fun facts, or not so fun facts for a Friday morning. They're amazing facts, Elise. I'm sure some of your listeners would love to get a list of those. Absolutely. But that's quite shocking, isn't it?
Mm.
That's something I'd love to get your take on, Maureen, because I think both of you have talked about this before, but when I come at it and I go, okay, so when even looking at the leadership of a lot of the companies I've worked for, how does that, I can look at stats like that, but how do we especially now that, you know, people are getting more used to digital tools, we've got more remote work. How do you start to facilitate change within an organization, Maureen, this year in particular?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, and I understand the complexities that Elise is talking about, you know, and I think what happens in the diversity and inclusion frame, because we've traditionally, you know, decided we need to do special things for special groups, and then the complication, as Elise mentioned, of intersectionality, and, you know, not all women are the same, and not all people who are of cultural difference are the same. I think for leaders, they start to get horribly confused. What am I supposed to do? So I guess the approach that I've been taking at a leadership level, which I've found is helping, is to actually, you know, put diversity aside for a moment. Just think of diversity as difference, and let's focus on the inclusion side of things. And inclusion means, you know, every individual feels like they're unique and feels like they have a sense of belonging. And if you can build that skill set in leaders, because that's hard to do, because we have a natural tendency to want to work with people who are a bit like us, you know, the easy people to manage because we know what to do. But when someone's just a little bit different from us and we're not quite sure what to do, we're also polite. We tend to kind of struggle with, well, what do I do here? And we don't do it. We also don't necessarily like the challenging person in our team, which is the difference that diversity brings to the equation. So my starting point is to build a skill set of managing difference, and just actually calling the white elephant in the room that managing difference, anyone who's different, is hard, right? So it requires you to pivot in a different way, to take a little bit more time, to be a little bit more patient, but the payoff is big. But once you've taught leaders the skill set of inclusion, you've got to pivot back to the dimensions of diversity, because otherwise they'll just, they think they're really inclusive, and they think they're doing the right thing. So you've got to get them to hone back in on things like gender and Indigenous and what have you, because otherwise they'll just ignore it and just to take a blanket approach.
I think I actually had one question just pop up. Someone noticed, Elise, that you are from a design background and that you do a lot of design. In that process, if you were talking about leadership and work processes, what would you, I guess, what is the thing that you would start with for redesign for people when they're engaging with you in that? Because I know that there's the leadership focus that Maureen's just been talking about there, but if there's a work process, at least that goes alongside that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that's a really good point, because when we're looking at design, which can encompass lots of things, and in our business we do everything from, you know, branding and websites all the way up to major public events in our region. When we are looking at design, the very first principle and kind of the core tenet of what you do is that you sit down with your audience, so the people, and you get to know them back to front. You have to have such a solid understanding of people and their problems, essentially. So when we're talking about design, we're talking about, you might have heard of design thinking. You know, it's basically this idea that you have to get to know the problem as best as possible. And for our process, this might involve the fact that we do, you know, lots of consultation. You know, 50% of the work is actually just consultation and really getting to know what people's problem is before you actually move on to what you need to do for them. Likewise, in this, you know, when we're doing that, we're talking with people, we're reading extensively. And actually, I was just thinking about this because, you know, when we are considering Black Lives Matter, or we are considering gender inequality, or something that essentially we know that we need to be doing better on, and we might not necessarily be there yet, we need to connect in person, we need to connect with people or over video. But we always must come informed. So, you know, we can't always just rely on, you know, the oppressed group or the minority group or the group that we're trying to include. We can't rely on them to educate us, because that's actually unfair. You know, we've got an active role in this. So in our work, we do as much background research as we can. We really try to get to understand things as we can see them. And then we come to the people. And so connect in person, but come informed would be my steps there. And really focus on the people and the problem, and then work through from there. Because when you are doing this, and actually that raises a good point I wanted to go to later, but co-design is also foundational to what we do. You know, if we were designing something for someone and we're using just what's in our own heads, we're not going to create what our client wants ever, because we haven't understood what they need. So when you're looking at your workplace and you're looking at policies and kind of what is the organization that you want to create, it does have to be co-designed, and that it's not enough just to say, okay, well, we need an Indigenous person on our team, we need a woman on our team, and we need someone from a disability on our team. That doesn't do it. And I've seen some really amazing models of shared leadership, for instance, with between generations, where, for instance, the CEO of a company might be a shared CEO role between someone who's, you know, very experienced, you know, in their kind of later stages of their career, and someone who is at the total opposite of their end, and, you know, maybe is a fresh graduate or kind of really at the start. Being able to bridge that and come in at things with a shared leadership and co-design kind of mind frame, that's actually where you get the best policies. It's where you get the best outcomes. That certainly applies to our work. We could not design alone. You just would not get the outcome that you needed.
I'm smiling, Elise, because, you know, to me, when people think diversity, they sort of jump in with all the best of intentions, right? But they do tend to take the Noah's Ark approach to diversity. You know, we'll have two of them and two of them and two of them, and that'll fix it. You know, and you know, my good friend Elizabeth Broderick likes to say, you know, pour in the women and stir, and that will fix it. It doesn't, right? So how do you actually change the water? How do you actually change the environment so that people are more willing to accept, and creating an environment of psychological safety? And it's, you know, and it's so complex, and certainly from my perspective, you know, probably one of the things that COVID has helped us do is actually be a little bit more inclusive, level the playing field a little bit more. I've seen, you know, webinars where people who are juniors are suddenly involved in conversations at senior level. They're hearing what's going on. So what we need to do is make sure we take the artifacts of what's happened in COVID that have been good, and how do we bring them forward into our new normal? What I'm typically hearing from leaders is kind of, oh yes, let's see what we get to bring with us. And I kind of go, no. You've got to get on the front foot. You've got to be a role model in this. What are you going to decide that you're going to bring forward? And what are you going to be intentional about in the way that you do that?
Yeah, and I would just say that's such a good point, because I've just finished this, you know, 3.5 year research project on women's leadership and women's representation in international affairs. And, you know, I was studying organizations that were, you know, heavily militaristic, you know, military organizations, right up to, you know, quite bureaucratic government agencies. And the thing that I found across them was that you got the most proportional representation. So if you had 40% women in the organization, you'd also have 40% in leadership. I found that would be the case in the organizations that were most structured. They might have been the most male-dominated organizations. They might have had the most, you know, masculinist cultures, or maybe you would say damaging cultures in some ways. But structure enables. So if you're really wanting to be genuine about this, and wanting to be genuine about, you know, whether it's women's progression to leadership, or whether it's about having the best kind of robust decision making, you actually need to get the policies right, essentially. And I think that this is the defining moment. We've been able to test a whole lot of things. Some have worked, some have not worked. But if you have the policies in place, if you have a structure there, then when everything else goes out the window, you can fall back and rely on that. And there is power in that. So I would absolutely recommend that, you know, be intentional. You know, for decades now, people have said, oh, you know, gender equality, you know, women's leadership, these things, it's a pipeline issue. This will gradually fix, like, you know, your generation doesn't have to worry, it will improve. And actually, we know from history that things don't just naturally improve like that. You know, if we look at any human rights over time, or any human progress, you actually need to keep things on the agenda, and you need to keep working at them. So be intentional.
And look, I agree with you, Elise, and I guess just in the last 15 years in being a big advocate for diversity and inclusion, particularly gender equity, I just layer on top of that. I'm a big, and I feel like I'm schizophrenic sometimes in what I'm saying is that, you know, I believe in a broader view of inclusion, but I do believe in quotas, which is a structure thing, right? But I would just layer on top of that is that what I've learned is that putting in place those structures is not enough, that the inclusion elements, so when it comes to gender diversity, actual getting real about gender inclusion as well, and having some measure of that is critically important, because otherwise you'll have all these different people there, but they're not bringing their difference to the table, right? And that's where you lose the magic of what we're trying to get to with diversity. Is it's embracing that difference, isn't it? And that quirkiness.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, you know, when we do this kind of activities or any session, any meeting, you know, recognize who's not in the room. And then secondly, recognize that who is in the room, they don't all have equal access to use their voice or be heard or listened to. So absolutely.
That's right. That's right. And you know, it's interesting in saying that, because, you know, I've heard it so many times from leaders where they'll say, yeah, but Maureen, I'm really open. You know, anyone can come to me. Anyone can share their views with me. And I say, but they won't. Right? So again, it's back to the intentional stuff. What can I do to demonstrate and to pull you towards me, right? So I've got to be a lot more proactive in the way that I manage. And that's the skill of managing difference. It's not assuming that someone's going to behave like you in the same set of circumstances, but it's also recognizing that feeling of, I don't quite fit, that feeling of feeling like you're a bit excluded, is quite subjective. So you can't as a leader say, well, you know, I've always felt included, and I've always, you know, in the same set of circumstances, I would feel included, so he or she should feel included. No. You've got to actually cross the road and look at the street from someone else's perspective. And that's actually really hard. You know, that you coin the phrase, step into someone else's shoes, but you actually don't understand those shoes, and you've never worn those shoes before. And, you know, those shoes feel jolly uncomfortable when you do try and put them on.
I guess that I would really love to know how that then applies to some concrete kind of, I guess, when we're going forward, some workplace points from there. Like if I think it's something I've put forward a couple of times to people, is when we look at, say I'm doing a lot more Zoom meetings now, and I've taken place in a few virtual writers' rooms before in my previous careers where there's a strong female representation, there's a strong cultural diverse representation, but as soon as the room is run by particular people in a particular way, or a meeting is run by people in a particular way, it's really easy virtually to just forget the people that you've brought in to get their different opinions and to not give them a place to be themselves. And that's even just in the writer's room where you need different people, let alone in the business sphere where you've got people at a table who are there to do very distinct jobs. How do we open up a conversation? Like, how do I go about facilitating conversations like that in this context?
Look, I've tried some really interesting things lately, Cam, just to throw some ideas out there. So, look, I guess the first thing is that if I've got, you know, I'm commonly on webinars where there might be 50, 60 people. And what I will do is firstly, I'm known for randomly picking on people, just only so that they stay awake. It's kind of a bit naughty, I know, but you know, like but I think that's important. So I'm going to pose a question. No one knows when I'm going to kind of go there. The other thing that I've done on a webinar is embrace silence, which is interesting, and people feel very uncomfortable with that up front. So what I will do is pose a question, and I ask everyone to go into the chat function and respond to that question. And I will literally put my timer on, put it on mute, have like 2 or 3 minutes silence. Because what I'm conscious of in even in this environment is that some people will prefer to communicate with a different medium. So you've got to take into account the quieter people. I'll also open up some other channels, things like polling and those sorts of things. So what you've got to do is remember that you've got 50 people on the line, but I mean, this applies in meetings, but everyone's going to want to communicate and learn in a different way. So what does that look like?
Yeah, I was just going to say that too, you know, what a unique way, like time right now to accept different forms of contribution to meetings and to our work. I mean, we you know, for years, basically, the flexible arrangements that we have now have been what people with disabilities or women have been arguing for, and, you know, always told, no, we can't do that, it's not possible. Well, it is possible now. And so now there really is this opportunity, okay, get creative, you know, and I think that you really can accept those different forms. And I'd say also, this kind of goes back to facilitation 101, you know, all the trainings. I think just after I finished high school, I went and worked on a summer camp in America, and we had to learn how to make sure that everyone's voice was heard. You know, it's really basic stuff in a way. Learning, okay, how do you pick on everyone and make sure that they get the opportunity? If you know that person doesn't respond well in a particular setting, okay, what is a setting that they could respond well to, or that they could contribute to? And then I'd also say, you know, this is an opportunity for different people to lead meetings too, and for you to see those different styles come to the fore and be able to shape their own contexts. And that's where, you know, having these breakout rooms or other ways of kind of getting that collective action together can be really fantastic. And I think that we should really be able to encourage that. Yeah, and secondly, I'd say, you know, flexibility. I think one of the great things about this whole time has shown that flexibility is possible.
Yep.
But I think that there's a warning there too. You know, we as organizations, we can't use that as an excuse, therefore, to say, oh, well, you should always be on, you know, you have the capability to do this. I know you have the capability to do this. So you should therefore always be on. And I think that in my research on, you know, diplomats and ambassadors and all the rest overseas, they were always working remotely, right? And the things that worked was therefore setting the hours that suited them, that they could tee up with headquarters. But for instance, not having to do meetings unless they were really needed, you know, hiring people to do a job and trusting them to do the job. And I think Patagonia has you know, some wonderful case studies there. And I'd strongly recommend you read the book by Yvonne Chouinard, the founder, called Let My People Go Surfing. Very interesting, you know, just looking at these different ways that we can look at inclusion and diversity in that way. And so I think that, you know, there is a lot of opportunity here to kind of get things right. It's a defining moment. Try to take the right stand now, be on the right side of history, but also be aware of the double side of things, or two sides to this.
I think that there's a question actually that's popped up, and we're heading towards the kind of question areas, because I know we've only got maybe 5 or so minutes left, unless people want to hang around for a bit longer. And that's, it got raised a little while ago. How do we then embed this, if we're talking about training or in school level, even in early years? What are some of the things that we're looking at? If I can read this, because my vision's not too great at the moment. Can we start addressing early too in schools? How do we start with the education ecologies? And I think that's relevant to the training space as well. I think, Maureen, is where does the education start, and where do we go from there?
And look, you know, if I had a magic wand, this would be part of curriculum, right? So talking about inclusion to a broader extent, I think we've gotten better at school systems. If you kind of compare to when I went to school, which by the way was a while ago, was, you know, I think that they have, you know, much more mix in schools, right? But you'll still find those environments. So I guess, you know, to me, if I look at if we take gender as an example, you know, the behaviour of little girls in school is still very gendered, right? Like and people, there are still lots of stereotypes that kind of permeate the direction of girls in schools, from IT to construction to a whole lot of other things. So to me, you know, and if you could tackle an education system, there would be some compulsory units, not just on what is diversity and inclusion, but how. You know, how and why. You know, why is this going to make me a more successful person if I'm able to embrace the world in a way that actually embraces that difference, right? And I think that we've got a lot of traditional norms in Australia where leaders and teachers need to be educated to. It's time to stomp them out. You know, the racial jokes, the things like that, they're not funny, you know, and you know, the well-meaning teacher who just sticks to embracing the stereotypes which have existed. We've got to stomp them out in our education system. It's hard because kids are still getting it at home, but if you can start at school and get kids to challenge the status quo, that might just change the world a little bit. We'd like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, Cam, when we were preparing for this, I think you had one question around, you know, if there was one big thing that you could change for organizations, you know, what would it be? And honestly, it would be exactly as you're saying, you know, start in the home, actually. You know, the big thing that comes out of gender inequality, racism, you know, homophobia, ableism, all of these things, they don't just exist in organizations. And in fact, the reason why they still have such a strong hold on our society and on our organizations is that they exist everywhere. And this is kind of what we call structural inequalities. So they're really this big stuff. And as Maureen was saying, you know, they are a result of, you know, this kind of socialization from a very young age, you know, in our family, you know, religion, education, you know, society, sporting groups, the whole thing. And everyone is kind of contributing these gendered or racist or, you know, ableist ideas to individuals, so that by the time you actually get to an organization, you're comprised of lots of different biases and, you know, discriminatory beliefs and everything. And it's a real process to unlearn as much as to learn, I think, as individuals and as organizations. And for me, so when we're talking about organizations, I think that there has to be a kind of realization that at the end of the day, your employees will go home to their families. And if their families have not progressed at the same rate as the organization, you'll always have a disjuncture. And that is just an unfortunate reality of our world. But we know that as much as the home life or, you know, other kind of wider things in our societies can have an effect on organizations, so can organizations in return. So it is a dual mechanism. And I think that corporates in Australia and across the world actually have really proven that they are able to step up and say, no, we believe in this, this is really important. They actually have a really big role model effect. I mean, I definitely saw it during the marriage equality debate a few years ago, but you see it all over the place. This is a real opportunity too for influence in return.
Yep. And look, I think, you know, Elise and Cam, you know, my advice to organisations would be this, is that, you know, given all of these complexities, the starting point, because I think that, you know, there's lots of factors in here and it can be a bit overwhelming for people, is the leadership team in your organisation has got to get together and reformulate their story for diversity and inclusion. And that's a process, right? So how do we take what we've done before? How do we take, but they've got to own that story, right? So once you've got that story, you've got a backbone for communications and a charter within your organization. But my advice then is and what I'm seeing in organization is, let's start to layer other things in that. You know, it's culture, it's bring in your behaviors, bring in your values. What's one story that the organisation can stick to? Because I think that there's a desperate need to simplify so that people understand exactly what it is that they need to do.
I think that's there's one question actually that I had prepared for that exact point, which is I've been involved in a few companies now which have come from the dreams of groups of friends. That they're always kind of a group of people got together, they've started something, and suddenly they're onto a winner, it grows and grows and grows, and you end up with kind of entrenched behaviors because of that, whether it's a group of young male, like the typical startup story is it's a group of young men that are together in a garage somewhere, and then they come up with an idea and someone gives them money and off they go.
And then you get an Uber.
Then you get an Uber. But then you end up with a group of young men in leadership, and then you end up with another group of male leaders, and then from the outside that might look like well, you've got no female leaders then, because they're more likely to hire people like them unless they're actively thinking about it. How do you, I guess if you're looking at an existing company, because I've hit the reverse as well, a group of young female leaders, and it was all young female leaders, and young men wouldn't apply for their company because they felt like they wouldn't even get the job. How do you go about changing that narrative, I guess, systemically through the company? Is it about that simple kind of rhetoric that's retold, or where do you start?
Look, I guess, you know, and you know, that exact circumstance, Cam. So I was brought in to help Uber once they had the explosion, you know, when they started having all of the, you know, sexual harassment claims and all of that sort of stuff, because that's exactly what had happened. It had grown from something small, which was kind of where a little bit of a boys club kind of thing was okay. but that culture had continued as it became bigger and bigger and bigger, and suddenly they had 13,000 staff and they had the same culture, right? And you had the CEO sending out emails that were kind of, you know, the sort of things that you might send out when you're at university to your mates, right? So yeah, you had to actually strip it right back. So look, again, in that kind of environment, it's getting leaders aware early, you know, so the earlier you start that in an organization, the more likely you are to start to make it. So the longer you leave it, the harder it is to fix it. Right. So if you think of culture as being like, you know, the water in which we all swim in an organization, you know, the muddier it is, the harder it is to clean it up. Right. So if you can clean it up early, the better. But the starting point for any organization, if you're completely muddy, is get the story right. But then there's a lot of other things that you need to do. So what, you know, I always say, if you're changing something, you want to embed something in people's brains generally. Think of the way that we learnt the multiplication tables. You got to repeat, right? And I know that says, and you've got to require action, and you've got to measure that action, right? So you've got to, it's a hard process, and that's why people tend to focus on the diversity side of things rather than the inclusion side. You know, the diversity side, which is just all about Noah's Ark, really, you know, counting numbers, it's important, but they tend to have a focus just on that. The inclusion side is a bit messier, and it's harder to measure, and it's harder to do because it requires a change in habit and a change in behavior, and people don't like that. It's a bit uncomfortable, right? So, but that's where we need to focus our energies, and that's where what you need to do is make sure that is truly embedded in the way we do things around here in any organization, and the sooner you do that in an organization, the better.
And I would say to follow up with that is that a lot of these kind of, when we're talking about workplace transformations, a lot of them focus on leadership and managers, which is great. We know that they are very important, and we know that they act as critical actors for our organizations, bringing them together and setting direction and all of the rest. But a big issue that I have with this, and that it plays out in the research, is that they do not often engage the rest of the population. So
no, that's right. They don't.
Who know what's happening, but they also are running a business. They're running all the finances. They're doing X, Y, and Z. They are not a critical mass. And then you get the rise of, in organizations, you know, for instance, I've seen it in my research, you know, young men being very disenfranchised, thinking, oh, well, what about me? You know, what's happening to these organizations? I'm no longer included. I don't understand. And you get fragmentation at a broader level. And so I think when you're talking about that kind of establishing that organization, establishing that culture is determined by, yes, leaders, but also by everyone else who partakes in it. And so I think that when we're looking at any kind of inclusion or any kind of training, really, it actually needs to start from the top and from the bottom, and it needs to go the whole way through the organization till those two meet.
And can I just say, that's why I love GoOne, right? Because and I, like, this is not an advertisement. You know this, Cam, that this is my theory. I've spent a lot of time in being engaged by organizations to tackle with the top, and it frustrates me so much that they never get to that critical mass. So with a platform like GoOne, it provides an ability for an organization to get to the four corners of the organization. And that's where you've got the opportunity for real change. So yeah, love the stuff you're doing at GoOne.
Oh, look, that's why we wanted to approach both people like Elise and you, Maureen, is to get education that can go out more broadly, because that's our focus, right, is the mass approach. Yeah. And I think we've gone a little bit over time, as the kind of more exciting webinars tend to do.
Can I just mention, there's a really great comment here, I've got to say it. So someone has said, Elise, please consider running for PM, Elise. And I agree. I agree. I love your views, and I think that, yeah, I'm up for that.
You might leave that to someone else, but thank you.
I think I'll let the kind of love in wrap to a close here, and I do agree, Lexi, at least for PM as well. But if we can finish on one thing, is there one piece in particular that has made each of you excited for the future? I would love to look at, is there something that you've seen or something that you're looking forward to that you've seen recently, and the way that things are going that's made you more excited for the future?
Yeah, well, I can start. Yeah, I'm really heartened and excited by Indigenous Lives Matter here in Australia. I think that never have we had such a robust conversation and brought issues of race into our homes in such a considered manner. And I think there's been a real big push to the two things I was talking about earlier, you know, learn and unlearn what we knew, try to learn what we don't know, try to understand other people. And I think that this is just such a golden moment. I'm also very excited because, you know, when I look around me at my peers, I'm just totally blown out of the water by them. I think that there's some real phenomenal leadership that is coming through. And likewise, I think that there's some really phenomenal leadership that we currently have who are actually out there, you know, taking a limb, taking a risk sometimes to maybe give opportunities to people who maybe wouldn't have had them otherwise, you know, and I see this particularly when I look at kind of youth, you know, and kind of the generation gaps, I suppose. I think that's really beautiful. So I am very excited. And I think that, you know, we are on the right track. I think that this is a really defining moment, and I'm really looking forward to what comes out of it, hoping that we can all do our part to educate ourselves and move organisations and our society forwards.
And if I can just respond to that, I'm really aligned to what you've said, Elise. You know, I've been on a number of global calls this week, and particularly with some really senior leaders and CEOs of big companies. And I think that, you know, COVID kind of woke people up. You know, some of the things that we've been saying for years that we can't do, we've suddenly pivoted and we've been able to do them. And then the racial issues have happened, right? And they've kind of stopped a nation again, right? So the exciting thing for me is that I think that world events have kind of slapped leaders in the face a little bit, you know, in a way that's hit them in the heart, right? And I think that until you start to feel it personally, you don't want change to happen. So I think what we now have is a burning desire and a burning platform for leaders to want change in their organisation, authentic change. And I think that's the exciting thing for me. What we need to do now is jump onto that while it's still hot before the next thing comes along.
I think that's a great place for us to bring this to a close, and I'll pull up the thank you screen and all those sorts of things. But in particular, I would love to thank you both for your time today, because it's always amazing talking to you each individually about what you're doing. To have you kind of bounce off each other and to hear the different perspectives here as well has been really special for me. You can find Maureen and Social Good Outpost at their different places, but you can also find pieces of their work on GoOne, and I would encourage you to check them out if you're a GoOne customer or a GoOne partner. But in particular, I would really encourage you to check out the work of the individual organizations, because the work that they do at different levels it's changed the way that I work. And I've been exposed to Elise for a few years and interacting with her, the way she approaches design, and being exposed to Maureen's approach just vicariously through companies that GoOne has worked with. We started talking to Maureen because we were already talking to a customer, and they said, you need to talk to these people who are shaping the way we're doing diversity and inclusion. So thank you both so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cam.
Thanks.
Proud to be partnered with GoOne. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.